India should be at the center of economic integration. But unfortunately, our policies in the past did not produce it. But today, there is an opportunity for it.
No, sir, in this week's Raja Mandala, taking off from Ukraine, you've looked at what's happening in South Asia, Asia as a whole, but South Asia in particular, and how the US may have an opportunity here in this region. One of the things you point out is that Pakistan's Pakistan, which was the US ally in the region for a long time, and the US, much like India has a soft corner, I think, for Russia, there was a US-Pakistan soft corner, particularly in the American establishment for that. That sheen has worn off over the last decade or so, to a large extent. How do you see that? How do you see that playing out in terms of what it can now do with India and other regions? Because India is not quite the kind of ally that Pakistan was. It's a much more equal relationship. So how do you see the US maneuvering that?
I think, historically, India was always so concerned about US relationship with Pakistan. Going back to the 1950s, when Pakistan joined the SEATO and CENTO, they had a bilateral security cooperation agreement. And for Indian foreign policy, opposing the alliances, especially the US-Pak, has been a major, theme. But over the decades, we saw the US-Pakistan relationship wax and wane. They were, for example, in the 50s, it was on the high. But after the 65 war, the Americans pulled back, saying, look, we don't want to be engaged with either country, India, Pakistan. And 71, they didn't really help Pakistan to survive from an Indian division of Pakistan. But when Afghanistan, then you had Russian intervention in Afghanistan, Pakistan came back into limelight. That lasted 10 years. And then the 9/11 attacks in 2001, another 20 years. So if we look at the last 75 years, I think the US-Pakistan partnership has been a central element of South Asia's international relations. I think now what's happened after the US has pulled out of Afghanistan, with some bitterness that Pakistan was responsible for its defeat, now I think they're really turning their back on Pakistan. You've seen the President Biden not calling Imran Khan, and Imran is very upset with that. Yeah. Nor is senior officials who come here, they don't stop by in Islamabad. So I think, there is a relative decline of Pakistan's position. And Pakistan's economy, for example, today is less than Bangladesh's. Bangladesh's economy is almost $60 billion larger than Pakistan's. And Indian economy is almost 10 times bigger than Pakistan's. So I think the relative weights of Pakistan, which used to be the second most important country, a lot of the Pakistanis saw themselves as equal to India. But today, I think Pakistan is a diminished nation, and notwithstanding its nuclear weapons. So I think once Afghanistan is taken out of the equation, the US does not see Pakistan as central. But in the case of India, US is not asking India to be an ally. India is not saying we want to be an ally. But I think they have larger convergent interests in the Indo-Pacific, where the weight of India, the size of India, and its capacity for large-scale action makes it central to the US Indo-Pacific strategy. That's the essence of Indo-Pacific strategy, was about putting Indo into the Pacific. Otherwise, US had its allies with Japan and Australia. So I think they value India in the context of the Indo-Pacific, despite our differences on Ukraine. This question is not going to disappear. And therefore, the India's weight and value are very different from the way Pakistan has played. That's what Imran Khan is complaining. That if you see, everyone is talking about it. See, India has always been, independent. Is an ally and not an ally, while Pakistan. And his whole critique is really not praising India. It's about a criticism of Pakistan's history, what he thought, like he's used repeatedly words like slavery, Pakistan, we should not be a slave to the United States or the West. So that is the context in which we're saying it. It's a left-handed compliment to India, but it's really an attack on the establishment in Pakistan and an attempt to mobilize the radical anti-Western forces within Pakistan. But the fact is, India and Pakistan are in very different places. We were never equal, but I think given the notions of parity, given the notions of nuclear weapons, it's always as if we are equal, and the whole of South Asia was always about India and Pakistan. But the moment the Americans put Pakistan aside, and they focus on the Indo-Pacific. Their interest in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Nepal are all growing. And this is a very different approach historically. It's not just today. It's a historically different approach of the US, which is focused on the Indo-Pacific. Therefore, it is willing to devote some energies to deal with the smaller countries of South Asia and deepen the partnership with India.
So another very interesting point you bring out in the piece, which everyone should read, it is on the indianexpress.com, as well as wherever you're watching this video, you should have it in the description, a link to the article. So, the BRI, which the CPEC BRI, this was this great Chinese threat countries joining till a few years ago, till very recently, but that luster seems to have worn off. To give the example of Sri Lanka as well as Pakistan, two countries which have heavily sort of went on the BRI and were part of China's, and they're both impoverished or have faced severe economic consequences as a result. Do you think, in that opening, what kind of does there need to be a more formal arrangement, more multilateral institutions? There is the World Bank and IMF, which is traditionally seen as sort of part of the West in some senses. Do you think that there should be something like that, like there was a BRICS Bank kind of formation, but with other powers now, which can help lending step into that role, which clearly the region needs and could be of great significance?
I think the politics in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, the Imran Khan came into power in 2018 saying, I'll never go to the IMF.
Yeah.
The idea somehow, that you don't need the Western institutions that were set up after the Second World War, and that the China can bail you out. I think it was a grand delusion. I think in Pakistan, Imran Khan came with that, and in Sri Lanka. While Ranil Wickremesinghe, the previous leader, was open to engaging the West, the Rajapaksa said, look, we don't need the West because the West raises human rights concerns. Therefore, I can avoid dealing anything to do with the West. So therefore, fully embraced China, both before when they were ousted in 2014 and when they came back in 2020. So I think that framework has not worked. That any day, what you get from the IMF World Bank is an ADB, which is again a Japan-led institution. The funding is reasonable, the terms are more liberal, but the politics of believing that China will be a savior actually saw both of them accept harsh economic terms from China in the name of standing up to the West. They were willing to mortgage their economic future to China. I think that is the main lesson I think we've seen happen. For example, Sri Lanka is desperately looking for hard currency, but in 2020, a generous economic assistance package of $480 million was rejected, saying, oh, this is all about, we don't want to get closer to the US argument, which I think was foolish. But today, Nepal, for 10 years, they had the same argument. Nepal was getting $500 million assistance to modernize their electricity distribution and other systems and promote connectivity between Nepal and India. But the Nepal communists said, no, this is all about Indo-Pacific. We're going to be sucked into it. We like BRI, but we don't like the Indo-Pacific. So that was the Nepal communists, which are a powerful force. But I think Doba now has broken through it. He's now saying, look, if any country, go not by the color of the money, but what the money does to you. Look, are the terms good? Are the interest rate reasonable? Is the money worth, what are the longer term implications of this loan? Rather than saying Chinese money is good, American money is bad.
Yeah.
So this is the twisted logic of politics in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, in Nepal, have produced a political discourse, which India used to have similar discourse in the 70s. Yeah. Anything from Soviet Union was good, anything from America was bad. So this ideological approach to economic development has been very costly. Nepal, I think it's a positive sign. They've broken out of it. Sri Lanka is under pressure to go back to the IMF and the World Bank. Last week, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the president, talked about going back to IMF. So I think the sheer compulsion of circumstances is going to change things. And this is where, if India, which is again, I think, giving a lot of assistance to Sri Lanka, some of its connectivity projects are finally taking off in Maldives, in Nepal, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka. So if India, US, Japan, Australia, and Europe has now announced a big infrastructure initiative. If we can pool our resources, if we can develop a coordinating strategy, we can offer alternative to the BR. So this is not about countering BR. I mean, I think we should be clear. People should have a choice, because last few years, there was no choice. The Chinese were just coming and offering money, but there was no a credible alternative, except the IMF World Bank, which you have to go through a formal process. So I think a developmental support from India, backed by the US and its allies, could produce a different set of choices.
Right.
Because you can't, Sri Lanka is sovereign, in the end they can do what they want.
Yeah.
And nobody can stop them. So can Pakistan. So, but there must be alternatives offered. And I think if India can do it in partnership with the US, it will produce a very different outcomes in the region. And it will lead to a US, a region centered around India, not tied to China. I think the logic of geography should be, India should be at the center of economic integration. But unfortunately, our policies in the past did not produce it. But today, there is an opportunity for that.
The final question, there is a sense, I don't know, there's talk, perhaps it's loose talk, that given the crisis in Ukraine now and Russia emerging once again as a Cold War-like figure for the West, that the West is going to be, America and the West as a whole is now distracted from the Indo-Pacific. Even if that were the case, can a lot of this stuff, you need the US blessing and the US framework, perhaps some money, but like what India is managing to get, it's not stopping our ties with Japan, India, just with Prime Minister Kishida's visit, or now with Australia, not perhaps financially at the same level, but that the middle path closeness doesn't have to be US directed necessarily. Is there a possibility for that, even in terms of economic assistance and projects?
I think this argument about US being distracted from the Indo-Pacific, that itself, I mean, I think it's not an absolute certainty. But a lot of people, worry about it, including US allies, Japan, Australia. And India too worries about, does focus on Russia take away the interest on China, because our interest is on China. But my sense is the US so far has shown the capacity to play on both sides, that it has the resources and partnerships to do that on both the fronts.
Yeah.
So for us, I think the question is, look, for India should be open to doing at all levels. If the Quad works on some areas, good, let's work with the Quad. If India, Japan can do some things in the region, we should do. There's an India, Japan, Australia, we can collaborate and do some things together. And there's some things India should do unilaterally.
Right.
Like in some of the recent projects, India has resources, like in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, in Maldives. India can contribute on its own. It doesn't have to work with, So I think if the question is, there are multiple possibilities, as long as we have a strategy that leverages our partnerships. It's by no means, it is not going to be US directed one. And the US itself wants partners who can do things. You don't want one more passenger on the American train.
Yeah.
For the American, they're not looking for passive. They want people with capabilities. India that is strong and capable of defending against China by itself will make it easier for the US to deal with the question on the seas in East Asia.
Yeah.
So this is not as if there is a bandwagon, either we're on it or we're not off it. Yeah. So I think India has ample space to pursue its own interests on the economic front, on the infrastructure front. Here, I think the trick for us is to seize all possible avenues for strengthening ourselves and our engagement with the region bilaterally, trilaterally, plurilaterally, and multilaterally.
Right, sir. Thanks so much, everyone. Read the column. It has a lot more insight in there as well. We'll see you next week, sir. Thank you so much.